In the harsh desert of Arizona Territory, a solitary Apache warrior named Joseph Walking Bear has spent 7 years without hearing joy in another human voice. The Apache wars have taken everything: his family, his people, his reason to smile. He moves through the wilderness like a ghost, existing but not truly living, until the day he saves a settler woman from bandits and hears something he thought lost forever: genuine laughter. Sarah McKenna is a widow heading west to start fresh after her own devastating losses. When the quiet Apache warrior risks his life to protect her wagon train, she sees past the scars and silence to the gentle soul beneath. Her laugh awakens memories he buried deep, and her kindness reminds him that some things are worth fighting for again. But can two broken hearts heal together when the world around them demands they remain enemies? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The dust cloud from the departing wagon train hung in the desert air like a ghost, and Joseph Walking Bear felt the familiar weight of solitude settle around his shoulders once more. He watched until the last canvas cover disappeared behind a red mesa, then turned his horse toward the mountains where silence lived. His fingers found the leather pouch at his belt, touching it through habit rather than comfort. Inside lay the broken pieces of his cavalry scout medal, snapped in half the day he learned the truth about Morning Star and Little Dove. The army had called him their best tracker, praised his loyalty, pinned that medal to his chest with ceremony and speeches about brotherhood between red man and white. They never told him that the same hands shaking his in congratulation had signed the orders that sent soldiers to his village while he was away, guiding other white men through other territories, believing he was building bridges between worlds. The memory came without invitation, as it always did. Morning Star's laugh echoing through their lodge as she watched Little Dove take her first steps. His daughter's eyes, dark as mountain pools, lighting up when he returned from long scouts. The scent of sage and sweetgrass that always clung to his wife's hair. Then the other memories, the smoke rising from where his village should have been. The silence where children's voices should have called his name. The bodies of his family, arranged with military precision in a line that told him this was no random raid, but a calculated message. The commanding officer had been apologetic when Joseph returned to fort. Regrettable mistake, he'd called it. Rogue elements acting without orders. But Joseph had seen the maps, had helped draw them himself. Every lodge, every trail, every safe place marked in his own careful hand, delivered to men who used his trust to perfect their aim. That night, 7 winters ago, Joseph Walking Bear had torn the medal from his uniform, broken it between his hands, and walked into the desert to die. But death had been too kind to claim him, leaving him instead to carry the weight of survival and the bitter knowledge that love made you weak, trust made you foolish, and hope was a luxury he could never afford again. His horse picked its way up the familiar trail to his camp, a shelter built into the rocks where no one would think to look for an Apache who'd once worn blue and called himself brother to his family's killers. Here he'd spent 7 years learning to live without the sound of human voices, without the warmth of another's touch, without the dangerous softness that came from caring about something more than your own next breath. But today, something had cracked in the careful walls he'd built around his heart. A woman's laughter, bright as water over stones, had cut through his defenses like an arrow finding its mark. Sarah McKenna, with her gentle hands and fearless eyes, had looked at him without the hatred he'd learned to expect, without the fear that usually sent white folk reaching for their weapons. She'd seen him save her wagon train and hadn't asked what he wanted in return. She'd offered him water from her own canteen and hadn't demanded to know why an Apache spoke English or why he wore the remnants of cavalry boots. She'd simply smiled, and in that smile he'd heard echoes of another woman's joy, felt the ghost of what it meant to be seen as a man rather than a threat. Joseph dismounted and unsaddled his horse, hands moving through the familiar routine, while his mind wrestled with the unfamiliar stirring in his chest. For 7 years he'd been dead inside, and dead men were safe from disappointment. from betrayal, from the kind of loss that taught you love was just another word for pain. But dead men didn't feel their hearts skip when a woman laughed. Dead men didn't lie awake wondering if somewhere in the desert night that same woman was looking up at the same stars and thinking of the stranger who'd appeared from nowhere to help her. Joseph pulled the broken medal from his pouch, its sharp edges catching moon. Once it had represented belonging, purpose, a place in a world bigger than himself. Now it was just metal and regret. A reminder that trusting the wrong people could cost you everything that mattered. He should throw it away, let the desert wind scatter the pieces like it had scattered so many dreams. But something stopped him, the memory of Sarah McKenna's voice, saying thank you, like she meant it, like his life had value beyond the violence he could deliver. Maybe some ghosts deserved to be carried a while longer. Sarah McKenna pulled her shawl tighter against the desert wind and checked the oxen's harnesses for the third time that morning. The wagon master, a gruff man named Henderson, had made it clear they would move at dawn regardless of who was ready, and she'd learned not to give him reasons to abandon her on the trail. The weight of Thomas's wedding ring pressed against her collarbone where she wore it on a thin chain, hidden beneath her traveling dress. 2 years since the farming accident that had taken him, 2 years since she'd held his hand while the life leaked out of him in their bed, and she still reached for him in the darkness between sleep and waking. Mrs. McKenna, your wagon sitting heavy on the left side. Henderson appeared beside her team, his weathered face showing the impatience of a man who'd buried too many dreamers in unmarked desert graves. You carrying something you don't need? Sarah's hand instinctively moved to protect the small wooden crate secured in her wagon bed. Inside lay her most precious possessions, Thomas's medical books, her collection of herb samples and folk remedies, and the carefully wrapped instruments she'd used to deliver babies and tend the sick back in Iowa. Everything she'd need to start the clinic she dreamed of opening in California. Nothing I can spare, she said firmly. Henderson spat into the dust. Dead weight kills more travelers than Apache ever did. But it's your funeral. As the wagon train lurched into motion, Sarah found herself thinking about the Apache warrior who'd appeared like a guardian spirit to save them from the bandits. The other women whispered about him with fear and fascination, crossing themselves when they spoke his name. But Sarah remembered different things, the careful way he'd checked each wounded traveler, the gentleness in his dark eyes when he'd looked at the children, the proud set of his shoulders as he'd ridden away without asking for thanks or reward. Most of all, she remembered how he'd listened to her laughter, without judgment, as if the sound surprised him in some way that had nothing to do with her being a white woman, and everything to do with her being alive and joyful in a world that seemed determined to crush both. You're thinking about that Indian again. Mary Patterson, the minister's wife from Ohio, drew her own wagon alongside Sarah's. It's not natural, a savage showing up right when we needed Dev, makes a person wonder what he was really after. Sarah kept her eyes on the trail ahead. He saved our lives, Mary. That seems natural enough to me. Indians don't do nothing without reason. Mark my words, we haven't seen the last of him. But as the days passed and the desert stretched endlessly before them, Sarah began to wonder if they had. The Apache warrior had vanished as suddenly as he'd appeared, leaving no trace except the memory of his quiet strength and the way he'd moved through violence like a man born to it, yet touched the wounded with the hands of a healer. She'd grown up on stories of Indian savagery, tales meant to keep children close to home and women properly fearful of the frontier. Yet when she'd looked into his eyes, she'd seen something she recognized, the deep weariness that came from losing what you loved most, the careful distance that kept the world from hurting you again. It was a look she wore herself, hidden behind busy hands and determined smile. At night, when the wagons circled and the men took turns on watch, Sarah would lie beneath her canvas cover and listen to the desert sing its ancient songs. The wind carried scents she couldn't name, sounds that might have been coyotes or night birds, or something wilder and more dangerous. Sometimes she imagined she saw a figure on horseback silhouetted against the distant mesas, but when she blinked, there was nothing but shadow and starlight. Her fingers would find Thomas's ring then solid and familiar against her skin. She'd married him when she was 19, full of dreams about love conquering hardship and building something lasting in the wilderness of Iowa. They'd been happy enough, in the quiet way of couples who'd grown into love rather than falling into it, partners in the daily work of survival and small contentments. But Thomas had never made her heart race the way it had when the Apache warrior's eyes met hers across the chaos of the bandit attack. Thomas had never looked at her like she was a puzzle worth solving, a mystery that might hold answers to questions he'd forgotten how to ask. Foolishness, she whispered to herself, but the word felt hollow in the vast darkness of the desert night. Maybe some kinds of foolishness were worth the risk. The attack came in the darkest hour before dawn, when even the guards' eyes grew heavy and the dying embers of the campfire cast more shadows than light. Sarah woke to screams and gunfire, the thundering of unshod horses, and war cries that turned her blood to ice water in her veins. She pressed herself flat against the wagon bed as bullets splintered the wood above her head. Through gaps in the canvas, she could see Apache warriors moving like shadows between the wagons, their painted faces terrible in the flickering light. This wasn't random violence. It was calculated, precise, designed to create maximum terror with minimum risk to the attackers. Henderson's voice boomed over the chaos. "Form up! Protect the women and children!" But his commands were lost in the screaming of horses and the crack of rifle fire that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Sarah clutched Thomas's medical bag, her heart hammering against her ribs. She should be helping the wounded, but terror had frozen her limbs. Through the canvas opening, she watched Mary Patterson dragging her 2 young daughters toward the dubious shelter of an overturned water barrel. Then she saw him. Joseph, walking bare, materialized from the darkness beyond the firelight, moving with deadly purpose toward 3 Apache warriors who had cornered a family near the lead wagon. For a moment, Sarah's mind couldn't process what she was seeing, an Apache attacking other Apache, protecting the very people his own people were trying to kill. His rifle spoke twice, dropping one warrior and sending the others scrambling for cover. He vaulted over a wagon tongue with fluid grace, his movements economical and lethal. But these weren't bandits fleeing at the first sign of resistance. These were warriors defending their homeland, and they recognized him as a traitor to his own blood. The fight that followed was brutal and personal. Sarah watched Joseph engage 3 men at once, his rifle forgotten now, fighting with knife and war club in the ancient way. Blood streamed down his face from a scalp wound, but his hands never wavered, his feet never lost their balance on the treacherous ground. When the last attacker fell, the sudden silence was deafening. Joseph stood swaying in the firelight, his chest heaving, blood soaking through his shirt from wounds. Sarah couldn't count. Around him, the survivors emerged from their hiding places like prairie dogs after a storm, eyes wide with shock and something that might have been gratitude or might have been fear. Henderson was the first to find his voice. "What the hell are you doing here, India? And why should we trust you didn't set this whole thing up?" Joseph's dark eyes found Sarah's across the wreckage of the camp. She saw exhaustion there, and pain, but also something that looked almost like relief, as if he'd been expecting this moment, this choice between his past and something he couldn't yet name. "These warriors hunt me too," he said, his English careful but clear. "I am no longer welcome in their lodges, because you help white folks." Henderson's hand rested on his pistol grip, "because I no longer believe all whites deserve to die." Joseph's gaze never left Sarah's face. "Some are worth saving." Sarah stepped forward, ignoring Henderson's warning gesture. Joseph's wounds needed tending, and she was done being paralyzed by fear. She'd spent 2 years running from the risk of caring about another person, of opening her heart to loss again. But watching this man fight for people who would never fully trust him, who might cast him out the moment convenience demanded it, she recognized a courage that shamed her own careful self-protection. "You're hurt," she said, moving closer, despite the blood and the way his knife hand still trembled with the aftermath of violence. "I have survived worse. That doesn't mean you have to." She reached for her medical bag, then hesitated. "Will you let me help you?" Something shifted in his expression, a crack in the armor he wore against the world. "Why would you want to?" "Because you've saved us twice now. Because you're bleeding on ground you didn't have to stand on." She paused, searching for words that would bridge the chasm between their worlds. Because everyone deserves someone to tend their wounds. Joseph looked down at her small hands, then back at her face. Slowly he nodded. As Sarah began cleaning his wounds by firelight, she felt the weight of the other travelers' stare, some grateful, some suspicious, all confused by this alliance that made no sense in their ordered world, where Apache were enemies and white women didn't touch Indian skin with gentle hands. But Sarah had stopped caring what made sense. All she knew was that this man had risked everything to protect people who owed him nothing, and now she would do the same for him. Joseph sat perfectly still while Sarah cleaned the gash across his shoulder, though she could feel the tension coiled in his muscles, like a spring wound too tight. His skin was warm beneath her fingers, marked with old scars that told stories of violence survived and battles won at terrible cost. "This needs stitching," she said, threading her needle by the light of the oil lamp. Henderson had grudgingly provided. "The bleeding won't stop otherwise. Apache warriors learn to live with scars, and white women learn to prevent them when they can." Sarah met his eyes, noting how he watched her hands with the weariness of a man who'd learned that trust was a luxury that could kill you. "I've done this before. My husband was a farmer. Machinery doesn't care how careful you try to be." Joseph's jaw tightened at the mention of her husband, though she couldn't tell if it was from pain or something else. "Your husband is dead. It wasn't a question." Sarah's hands stilled for a moment, then resumed their work. 2 years now, farming accident, like I said. You wear his ring." Her free hand moved instinctively to the chain around her neck. "How did you? Apache notice what others hide. Is why we stay alive when enemies hunt us." Joseph studied her face in the lamplight. "You still love dead man." Sarah's cheeks burned. "That's not. It's complicated. Death is not complicated. Is final. But you carry his ghost like medicine bundle, afraid to put it down." The accuracy of his observation stung. Sarah had spent 2 years wrapped in Thomas's memory like a protective cloak, using grief as an excuse to avoid the risks that came with living fully. She'd told herself the ring was about honoring his memory, but perhaps it was really about keeping her heart safely closed. "And what about you?" she asked, beginning the delicate work of stitching. "What ghosts do you carry?" Joseph was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Wife, daughter, killed by white soldiers while I was away, guiding other white soldiers through Apache land. I taught enemies how to find my own family." Sarah's needle paused. She'd heard stories of cavalry raids on Indian villages, usually told as victories over savage raiders. She'd never considered what it might feel like to be on the other side of those stories, to lose everything because you'd tried to build bridges between worlds that seemed determined to destroy each other. "I'm sorry," she said, inadequate words for unspeakable loss. Sorry is white word. Sarah tied off the last stitch and reached for her medical journal, its leather cover soft from years of use. The pages held everything she'd learned about healing, remedies passed down from her grandmother, techniques learned from the doctor who delivered her in Iowa, observations from years of tending the sick and injured. "This is willow bark tea," she said, showing him the dried strips in her pouch, "for pain and fever, and this is calendula salve, for the smaller cuts." She demonstrated how to apply it, her fingers careful on his skin. "The Apache must have their own medicine. My grandmother was medicine woman, taught me some plants, some prayers." Joseph watched her hands work. "But Apache healing is about spirits, about balance between seen world and unseen world. White medicine is about fixing what is broken. Maybe that's what we both need," Sarah said softly. "Fixing what's broken." Joseph captured her wrist with surprising gentleness, his calloused fingers circling her small bones. "Some things break too completely to fix. Can only learn to live with sharp edges." Sarah didn't pull away from his touch, though her heart hammered against her ribs. "Or maybe you find someone whose sharp edges fit with yours." They sat in silence as the desert wind whispered around the wagon, carrying sense of sage and possibility. The fever had taken hold of little Emma Patterson during the night, and by morning the 6-year-old lay burning in her mother's arms while Mary rocked back and forth, whispering desperate prayers into the desert air. Sarah had tried everything in her medical supplies: willow bark tea, cool compresses, even the precious laudanum she'd been saving for emergencies, but the child's temperature continued to climb. Joseph appeared at the wagon's edge as Sarah emerged from checking on Emma for the 4th time that hour. 3 days had passed since the Apache attack, and he'd remained with the train as an unofficial guide and protector, though most of the travelers still watched him with suspicious eyes. "The child is dying," he said. It wasn't a question. Sarah wiped her hands on her apron, exhaustion weighing her shoulders down. "The fever won't break. I don't know what else to try." Joseph studied her face, then looked toward the wagon, where Emma's labored breathing was audible even over the morning wind. "Apache have medicine for burning sickness. It requires trust." "What kind of trust?" "Must take child away from camp to sacred place. Make ceremony with plants that grow only in hidden places." Joseph's dark eyes met hers. "Mother must let Apache take her daughter into desert alone." Sarah's heart clenched. Mary Patterson had barely allowed Joseph near their wagon, crossing herself whenever he approached, and muttering prayers for protection from savages. The idea of letting him take Emma into the wilderness would seem like surrendering her child to the devil himself. "She'll never agree to that." "Then child dies. Is choice every mother makes, fear or love." Sarah found Mary sitting beside her daughter's still form, tears cutting tracks through the dust on her cheeks. Emma's lips were cracked, her small chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow breaths that spoke of time running out. "Mary," Sarah began carefully, "Joseph thinks he can help Emma. His people have medicines for fever that mine don't." Mary's head snapped up. "That's savage. You want me to trust my daughter's life to a heathen who probably caused this sickness in the first place? He saved us from the raiders. He's been protecting us for 3 days. To lull us into trusting him. Don't you see? This is how they work. They create the problem, then offer to solve it, and we're supposed to be grateful when they don't kill us all." Sarah knelt beside her friend, taking Mary's trembling hands. "Look at your daughter, Mary. Really look at her. Do you think she has 3 more hours? 2? Mary's face crumpled. "God will provide. He has to. Maybe God is providing. Maybe he sent Joseph to us for this reason." When Sarah returned to Joseph, she found him sitting cross-legged beside the wagon, his hands working something from his belt pouch. As she approached, she saw it was a small wooden horse, no bigger than her palm, carved with intricate detail that spoke of hours of patient work. "You made this?" he asked. Joseph's hands stilled. "For my daughter, little Dove. She loved horses, always begged me to carve animals for her games." He held the horse up to catch the morning light. "Was making this when the soldiers came. Never got to give it to her." Sarah's throat tightened. Sarah felt the weight of Thomas's ring against her collarbone, the familiar comfort of a past that suddenly seemed impossibly distant. She thought of Iowa farms and Sunday church services, of a world where law meant something and violence happened to other people in distant places. That world felt like a child's fairy tale now. The lead cavalry officer dismounted and began examining something on the ground. Tracks, most likely, or the ashes of their last night's fire. Even at this distance, Sarah could see his practiced movements, the way he read sign like a book written in dust and broken vegetation. "There's another option," Joseph said, so quietly she almost missed his words. "What?" Joseph reached into his saddlebags and withdrew something wrapped in oiled cloth. When he unfolded it, Sarah's breath caught. A cavalry saber, its blade nicked and stained but still sharp, its brass hilt engraved with initials she couldn't read from her position. "Took this from the officer who killed my family," Joseph said, his voice empty of emotion. "Thought someday I would use it to cut his throat, but maybe better use is buying your safety." Sarah's mind reeled. "You mean surrender yourself to save us?" "Mean walk down there with this saber, and the truth about who I am. Give them what they really want, and maybe they let you go with warning about trusting Apache guides. Joseph, no. The words came out stronger than she'd intended, surprising them both. We don't abandon people who've saved our lives. White woman's sentiment, Joseph said, but something flickered in his dark eyes that might have been gratitude. Apache pragmatism says one death better than many deaths. Then maybe, Sarah said, surprised by her own courage, it's time to try something that's neither white nor Apache, something that's just human. The hidden canyon Joseph led them to felt like the Earth's secret, a narrow slash between towering red stone walls where centuries of flash floods had carved a refuge invisible from the rim above. Ancient petroglyphs covered the rock faces, spirals and hunting scenes, and symbols that spoke of other people who'd found sanctuary in this forgotten place. The cavalry patrol had lost their trail in the maze of canyons above, but Joseph knew it was temporary safety at best. By morning, the soldiers would have regrouped and begun a systematic search of every hiding place within a day's ride. Time was running out like water through cupped hands. As evening shadows deepened in their stone refuge, Joseph sat apart from the others, his back against the canyon wall, something clutched in his weathered hands. Sarah approached quietly, recognizing the stillness that came over him when he wrestled with decisions that would shape all their futures. The others are frightened, she said, settling beside him on the sandy floor. Fletcher thinks we should have stayed with the main wagon train. Mary keeps asking if Emma will see another Christmas. Joseph opened his hands, revealing a single eagle feather, its brown and white pattern perfect despite obvious age. The quill was wrapped with sinew and tiny beads in colors that caught the dying light. Red like canyon stone, blue like desert sky, white like winter snow on distant mountains. My grandmother gave me this when I reached manhood, he said, his voice soft with memory. Told me eagle flies highest, sees farthest, carries prayers to the spirits when the path becomes unclear. Sarah studied the sacred object, understanding instinctively that she was being trusted with something precious beyond measure. Are you asking for guidance? I'm asking spirits of my ancestors what to do with white woman who refuses to let Apache die for her safety. Joseph's dark eyes found hers. I'm asking what Little Dove and Morning Star would want me to choose. The mention of his murdered family sent a pang through Sarah's heart. She'd grown to understand that Joseph carried their spirits with him like other men carried weapons, their memory both burden and strength in the endless battle to survive in a world that offered him no place of belonging. What do you think they would tell you? Joseph was quiet for a long time, his thumb stroking the eagle feather with reverent care. Around them, the canyon walls seemed to lean inward, as if the ancient stone itself was listening for his answer. Morning Star always said revenge is like drinking poison and expecting your enemy to die. Said hatred burns the one who carries it, leaves nothing but ash where love used to grow. Joseph's voice grew distant, remembering, Little Dove, she would ask why I want to hurt people instead of helping them. And what would you tell her? That sometimes hurting enemies is only way to protect the innocent. Joseph looked up at the first stars appearing in the narrow strip of sky above the canyon. But maybe little girl's wisdom is deeper than warrior's logic. Sarah watched him prepare for the ceremony with movements that spoke of rituals older than memory. He gathered dry wood for a small fire, arranged stones in a pattern that meant something to traditions she didn't understand, sprinkled tobacco and something that smelled like sage into the flames. When he began to speak, it was in Apache, words that flowed like water over stone, rising and falling with the rhythm of ancient prayers. Sarah couldn't understand the language, but she felt the power in it, the connection to something larger than their immediate danger. The eagle feather moved in Joseph's hands as is caught by wind that touched nothing else. In the dancing firelight, Sarah saw his face transformed, the harsh lines of pain and anger softening into something approaching peace. When the ceremony ended, Joseph sat in silence for several minutes before speaking. Spirits say the path forward requires courage, but not the courage of warriors, requires the courage to build instead of destroy, to trust instead of fear. What does that mean for us? Joseph looked at her with eyes that held new clarity. Means we don't run from cavalry, don't fight them, don't surrender to them. He paused, gathering words for a truth that surprised even him. Means we show them another way is possible. Sarah felt her heart race. Joseph, they have orders to bring you in dead or alive. You can't negotiate with men who see you as less than human, cannot negotiate with their hatred. Joseph agreed, but maybe can speak to their humanity. Maybe can show them that Apache and white can stand together, can choose peace over war. And if you're wrong, Joseph tucked the eagle feather carefully into his shirt, then at least we die trying to build bridges instead of burning them. Dawn broke over the canyon rim like a judgment, painting the red stone walls with shades of blood and gold, while Sarah lay awake listening to the sounds of a camp, preparing for what might be their last morning together. Joseph had spent the night on watch, his silhouette motionless against the stars as he kept vigil over the sleeping travelers who'd trusted him with their lives. She found him at the canyon's mouth, studying something in his hands with the expression of a man reading his own death warrant. When she approached, he didn't try to hide what he held, a folded paper, worn from handling, that made her stomach clench with recognition before she even saw the words. The wanted poster bore Joseph's likeness sketched with surprising accuracy, though the artist had emphasized the harsh planes of his face, making him appear more savage than the man she'd come to know. The bounty amount printed beneath his image was staggering, enough money to buy a good farm or start a business in California. Where did you get this? Found it in cavalry officer's saddlebag 3 winters ago when I took his saber. Joseph's voice was flat, empty of emotion. Carried it to remind me what I am worth to white man's justice. Sarah read the charges listed below his picture: desertion from U.S. Army, murder of cavalry personnel, suspected collaboration with hostile Apache forces, crimes against U.S. citizens. Each accusation felt like a stone dropped into still water, rippling outward with implications she was only beginning to understand. Are they true? Joseph was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he spoke, his words came carefully, as if each one carried weight that could crush what remained between them. Desertion, yes. Left army the night I found my family's bodies. Murder of cavalry personnel. He paused. 3 men died by my hand. The ones who boasted in the saloon about killing Apache squaws and their half-breed spawn. Sarah felt something cold settle in her chest. She'd known Joseph was dangerous, had seen him fight with deadly efficiency, but hearing him admit to killing soldiers made the reality of his situation unavoidably clear, and the collaboration charges. Every time I warned Apache camps about cavalry raids, every time I led my people away from army patrols, every time I chose my blood over my oath. Joseph's dark eyes met hers, crimes they could hang me for 12 times over. The morning air felt suddenly thin, as if the canyon walls were pressing close. Sarah had spent weeks telling herself that Joseph was just a man caught between worlds, that his past was tragedy rather than criminality. The wanted poster stripped away those comfortable illusions, forcing her to confront the truth about the man she was falling in love with. Sarah, Joseph's voice was gentle, but she heard the finality in it. You should take the others and surrender to the cavalry. Tell them I forced you to come this way, that you were my prisoners. They will believe that, will let you go with warnings about trusting Apache guides. And what about you? I will disappear into the desert, find another way to live, another place to hide, is what I should have done from the beginning. Sarah stared at the wanted poster, at the dollar amount that represented Joseph's life, reduced to a transaction. She thought of the conversations they'd shared around evening fires, the gentleness in his hands when he'd healed Emma Patterson, the way he'd looked at her when she laughed, as if she'd reminded him what joy sounded like. Is that what you want? To spend the rest of your life running and hiding? Is what I deserve? According to who? The men who put a price on your head after they slaughtered your family. Joseph's jaw tightened. According to the law, according to justice, according to the fact that good women do not love men with blood on their hands. The words hung between them like a challenge, and Sarah realized this was the moment of choice she'd been avoiding since the night she first tended his wounds. She could accept the easy path, the safe explanation that would return her to the world where moral choices were simple and love didn't require courage. Or she could choose the harder truth, that some laws were unjust, that some blood was spilled in defense of what mattered most, and that love worthy of the name demanded standing with someone even when the world called them enemy. "Joseph Walking Bear," she said, surprising herself at the steadiness of her voice, "you saved my life twice, protected children who weren't your own, and guided us through dangers you could have avoided. If that's what criminals do, then maybe I need to reconsider what I think about the law." The wanted poster fluttered in the morning breeze, its accusations suddenly seeming less like truth than like evidence of how badly the world had failed the man standing before her. The tracking stone felt warm in Joseph's palm as he crouched at the canyon's edge, reading the desert floor like a book written in disturbed sand and broken twigs. The small piece of red jasper, marked with scratches that looked random to untrained eyes, was a navigation tool his grandfather had taught him to use, each mark corresponding to landmarks, water sources, and safe passages through Apache territory. Below them, the cavalry patrol had spread into a search formation, 23 soldiers methodically combing every gulch and rock formation where fugitives might hide. Their leader, a captain with silver hair and the bearing of a man who'd spent decades hunting Apache, studied tracks with the patience of someone who understood that desert warfare was won by persistence rather than speed. "They know we're here," Joseph said quietly, rejoining the huddled group of travelers pressed against the canyon wall. "Found where we watered the horses 2 days ago, probably picked up individual boot prints. Following our exact path now." Henderson's face had gone grey with fear. "How long before they find this canyon?" Joseph consulted the tracking stone, his thumb tracing the ancient marks while he calculated distances and terrain. "Maybe 2 hours, maybe less if they have Apache scouts with them." "Apache helping the cavalry hunt you?" Sarah asked. "Some of my people take army pay rather than starve on reservations. Cannot blame them for choosing survival over pride." Joseph's voice carried no bitterness, only the weary acceptance of someone who'd learned that desperation could corrupt any principle. "But makes them dangerous. They know Apache hiding places as well as I do." Fletcher grabbed Joseph's arm with shaking hands. "There has to be another way out of here. A back trail, something they won't expect." Joseph studied the tracking stone again, then looked up at the narrow strip of sky visible between the canyon walls. "There is path, very dangerous, requires climbing canyon walls where eagles nest, following ledges barely wide enough for one person. Some places one mistake means falling to death." "Better than capture," Henderson said grimly. "Not for children, not for women in traveling dresses. This kind of climbing." Joseph shook his head. "Apache children learn these skills from birth. White settlers with heavy packs and no experience will not survive." Sarah felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came with impossible choices, stay and face capture, with Joseph certain to hang and the rest of them likely to be punished as accomplices, or attempt an escape that might kill them just as surely, but with less chance of taking everyone down together. "What if we split up?" she suggested. "Some of us try the climbing route while others—" "No." Joseph's voice was sharp. "Desert kills separated groups. Wolves pick off stragglers. Apache survive by staying together, by sharing strength when individuals grow weak." The sound of horses echoing off distant canyon walls cut through their debate. The search was closing in, methodical and relentless as winter weather. Joseph stood, his decision made with the swift certainty of someone accustomed to life or death choices. "We climb," he said. "I will go first, find safest route, secure rope where needed. You follow exactly in my footsteps, do exactly what I do, think about nothing but the next handhold." Mary Patterson clutched Emma against her chest. "I can't do this. I'm afraid of heights." And Emma's still weak from the fever. Joseph knelt before the frightened woman, his dark eyes gentle but unyielding. "Fear will kill you faster than falling. Apache mothers carry babies up cliff faces when enemies come. You have that same strength, Just need to trust it. He distributed their remaining rope among the strongest climbers, showed them how to secure it around their waists, explained hand signals for communication when speaking would be dangerous. Sarah watched him transform from reluctant guide to war leader, his movements economical and confident as he prepared them for an ordeal. None of them were trained to survive. "Remember," he said, securing his own rope and checking the tracking stone one last time before tucking it safely away. "Fear makes you grip too tight, tire too quickly. Anger makes you move too fast. Take foolish risks. Stay calm, stay focused, stay alive." The first rifle shot rang out from the canyon mouth, followed by shouted orders in English and what sounded like Apache. The search had found their hiding place. Joseph was already moving, his hands finding holds in the red stone that seemed impossible until Sarah watched him use them. 20 feet up the canyon wall, he paused and looked down at the frightened faces below. "Come," he called softly. "Trust the stone. Trust your hands. Trust me." The bell hung silent in the crumbling tower of the old Spanish mission, its bronze surface green with age and desert weather, but its voice still capable of calling the faithful to prayer, if anyone remained to pull its rope. Sarah stared up at it through the gap in the adobe roof, amazed that something so delicate had survived decades of abandonment in this forgotten valley, where even the wind seemed to whisper prayers. They'd been climbing for 6 hours when Joseph led them over the canyon rim and down into this hidden sanctuary, a valley so narrow and well concealed that it appeared on no territorial maps, known only to Apache traders and the ghosts of Spanish priests who'd built their mission here 2 centuries ago. The cavalry patrol had given up the pursuit at the canyon walls, unwilling to risk horses and men on the treacherous climb that had nearly claimed 3 of their own group. Emma Patterson slept in her mother's arms beneath the shelter of the old altar, the carved wooden horse still clutched in her small hands. Mary had surprised everyone during the climb, her fear transformed into fierce determination when her daughter's life depended on her courage. Fletcher sat against a crumbling wall, his merchant's soft hands bleeding from the rough stone, but his eyes bright with the satisfaction of a man who'd discovered strength he didn't know he possessed. Henderson was exploring the ruins with the practical eye of someone calculating defensibility and resources. "Well," he announced, returning from his survey of the compound, "there's a spring that runs year-round, walls that could be patched with some work, and enough shelter for twice our number. Not the California we were headed for, but it'll keep us alive." Sarah found Joseph standing in what had once been the mission garden, studying the remains of fruit trees gone wild and herb patches reverting to desert scrub. The Spanish fathers had chosen their location well, protected from wind, blessed with water, positioned to catch the morning sun while avoiding the brutal heat of afternoon. "How long do you think we can stay here?" she asked. "Until cavalry gives up search, maybe a month. Until winter storms make travel impossible, maybe 3 months." Joseph knelt beside a struggling rosebush, its thorny branches reaching towards sunlight despite years of neglect. "Apache know this place, but most consider it haunted by Christian spirits. Will leave us alone if we don't interfere with their hunting grounds." Sarah watched him work his fingers into the soil around the rose's roots, testing its moisture and texture with the instinctive knowledge of someone who'd learned to read the earth's secrets. "You know about gardening. Morning Star grew corn, beans, squash in our village. Taught me that caring for growing things requires patience, understanding what each plant needs to thrive." Joseph's voice carried the soft pain that always accompanied mentions of his murdered wife. Said Apache, who could not tend growing things, could not tend anything worth keeping. The mission bell caught Sarah's attention again, its surface etched with Latin words she couldn't read but somehow understood, something about faith, hope, the eternal nature of love that transcends death. The Spanish priests who'd hung it here had believed they were bringing civilization to the wilderness, but perhaps they'd simply been trying to create a place where different worlds could meet without violence. "Joseph," she said, the words coming before she'd fully formed the thought, "what if we stayed?" He looked up from the rosebush, his dark eyes questioning. "Not forever," Sarah continued, her mind racing with possibilities she'd never considered. but long enough to see what we could build here, together. The silence stretched between them, filled with the sound of wind through broken walls and the distant murmur of the spring that had drawn Spanish missionaries and Apache warriors to this same patch of earth for generations. White woman and Apache renegade, Joseph said finally. Living in abandoned mission like hermits hiding from the world, or like two people who found something worth protecting. Joseph stood, brushing soil from his hands. Sarah, you have life waiting for you in California. Clinic to build, people to help, future that makes sense. Why would you give that up for man with bounty on his head and no future beyond staying hidden? Because, Sarah said, surprised by the certainty in her voice, maybe some futures are worth more than safety. Maybe some lives are worth the risk of building something new instead of accepting what everyone expects. The mission bell swayed slightly in the desert breeze, its bronze surface catching late afternoon light, like a promise that some things endure beyond the people who create them. The Apache war party materialized from the desert heat, like a fever dream, 20 warriors painted for war, their horses decorated with symbols. Sarah didn't recognize but understood meant death for anyone who stood in their way. She pressed herself against the mission wall, her heart hammering as Joseph stepped forward to meet them, his hands empty but his bearing that of a man prepared to die fighting. The war leader dismounted with fluid grace, his face painted in black and red stripes that made his eyes look like coals burning in a skull. He spoke to Joseph in rapid Apache, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience. Joseph replied in the same language, his tone respectful but not submissive. Sarah couldn't understand the words, but she could read the tension in Joseph's shoulders, the way his weight shifted onto the balls of his feet. Whatever was being discussed, it involved more than just their presence in the hidden valley. The conversation continued for several minutes, other warriors occasionally adding their voices while Henderson and the others watched from the mission doorway, hands close to weapons they all knew would be useless against so many experienced fighters. Finally, the war leader reached into a leather pouch and withdrew something that made Joseph go absolutely still. It was a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age and torn at the edges, but still bearing the official seal of the U.S. Army. The war leader spoke again, his words sharp with what sounded like accusation, holding the document like evidence in a trial where Joseph stood as the accused. Joseph accepted the paper with trembling hands, unfolded it, and read its contents with the expression of a man watching his world collapse. Sarah saw his face drain of color, saw his jaw clench with the effort of maintaining control, saw something die in his dark eyes that she feared might never live again. "What does it say?" she called out, unable to bear the silence any longer. Joseph looked up from the document, his voice hollow when he finally spoke. "Is military dispatch, dated 3 days before the raid on my village, orders from Fort Apache to Company C, 1st Cavalry, instructions to eliminate hostile Apache encampment at coordinates that match exactly where my family lived." Sarah felt ice form in her stomach. "But you said it was a random attack." "I was wrong." Joseph's voice was barely audible, was not random, was planned, calculated. They knew exactly where to strike, exactly when the men would be away hunting, exactly how many women and children would be defenseless. The war leader spoke again, his words cutting like blades. Joseph translated without being asked, as if the truth demanded to be spoken in both languages. "He says the soldiers who planned this raid are still alive, still serving at Fort Apache, still receiving medals and promotions for their success in pacifying hostile tribes." Joseph's hands shook as he refolded the dispatch. "Says the Apache Nation demands justice for the innocents who died." "What kind of justice?" Joseph met her eyes across the space between them, and Sarah saw in his face the war between the man she'd come to love and the Apache warrior whose family's blood cried out for vengeance. Blood justice. The old way, hunt down the officers who gave the orders, the soldiers who carried them out, make them pay in pain for the pain they caused. The war leader mounted his horse, speaking one final time to Joseph before turning to go. The other warriors followed, but their departure felt less like retreat than like giving Joseph time to make his choice. "What did he say?" Sarah asked when they were alone. "Said I have until the next full moon to decide whether I am still Apache or whether I have become something else. If I choose to ride with them, they will help me claim the justice my family deserves. If I choose to stay here with white woman, playing house in dead priest's mission." Joseph's voice trailed off. "Then what? Then I am no longer their brother, no longer welcome in Apache lodges, no longer protected by Apache law." Joseph looked down at the dispatch in his hands, but also no longer bound by Apache obligations for vengeance. Sarah understood the choice being offered: revenge or love, the past or the future, the justice his people demanded or the peace he'd begun to find in her arms. In 3 weeks, when the moon rose full again, Joseph Walking Bear would have to decide who he truly was and what kind of man he wanted to be. The red clay mixed with bear grease felt cold against Joseph's skin as he applied the war paint by moonlight, his reflection wavering in the mission's ancient well like a ghost caught between two worlds. The pattern was one his grandfather had taught him: 3 diagonal stripes across each cheek, a line from forehead to chin that marked him as a seeker of justice, dots around his eyes that honored the spirits of the dead who demanded vengeance. Sarah watched from the mission doorway, her white dress ghostly in the starlight, her face pale with the understanding that the man she loved was preparing to ride away into violence that might claim his life or damn his soul. 2 weeks had passed since the Apache war party's ultimatum, 2 weeks of tortured nights when Joseph wrestled with choices that had no clean answers. "You've decided," she said. It wasn't a question. Joseph continued applying the paint with ritual precision, each stroke carrying weight of tradition and purpose. "Apache law demands blood for blood. My family's spirits cannot rest while their killers live in comfort, receiving honors for murdering innocents. And what about us? What about what we've built here?" Joseph paused, his hand stilling on the war paint. In the 2 weeks since the Apache ultimatum, they'd begun to transform the mission into something approaching a home, patching walls, cleaning the spring, coaxing life from the abandoned garden. More importantly, they'd found a rhythm of daily existence that felt like the foundation of something permanent, something worth building a future around. "What we have built is beautiful," Joseph said quietly, "but is built on pretending that past can be forgotten, that justice can be avoided, that love is enough to wash away blood debt." Sarah stepped closer, her bare feet silent on the stone floor. "Joseph, if you do this, if you hunt down those soldiers, you'll become exactly what they always said you were: a savage, a killer. Everything we've proven wrong about the hatred between our peoples, maybe that is what I am. Maybe trying to be something else was the lie. No." Sarah's voice carried fierce conviction. "I've seen who you really are. I've watched you heal a sick child, protect people who feared you, choose mercy when you could have chosen violence. That's not pretending to be something else. That's being who you truly are." Joseph met her eyes in his reflection. "And I have seen who you are, brave woman, who left everything safe and familiar to build new life in dangerous country. Why would you throw that away for man who may not come back from the path he must walk?" "Because," Sarah said, reaching for the small pouch of war paint, "maybe you don't have to walk that path alone." Joseph stared at her, not understanding until she dipped her finger into the red clay and drew a single line down her own forehead, not in any Apache pattern she understood, but in recognition of the choice they faced together. "Sarah, no. This is Apache business. This white woman has no place in war party seeking vengeance for." "This isn't about war parties or vengeance," Sarah interrupted. "This is about justice, about making sure the men who planned that massacre face consequences for their actions. And maybe there's another way to do that, a way that doesn't require you to become something you're not." Joseph studied her painted face, seeing something he hadn't expected, Not the frightened settler woman who'd laughed in surprise at his protection, but a partner who understood that some battles were worth fighting and some stands were worth taking, regardless of the personal cost. What other way? Sarah reached into her medical bag and withdrew the military dispatch the Apache war leader had left behind. This document is evidence of a war crime, proof that cavalry officers planned the murder of civilians. The territorial governor, the newspapers, the military courts, they might not care about Apache justice, but they do care about officers who disobey direct orders about protecting civilians. Joseph considered her words, feeling the weight of tradition pulling against the possibility of a different kind of justice, one that might hold his family's killers accountable without requiring him to sacrifice his soul or his future. And if white man's justice fails, if evidence is buried, if guilty men are protected by their uniforms. Sarah finished her own war paint, simple stripes that declared her readiness to stand beside him whatever came next. Then we'll face that choice when it comes. But right now we have a chance to try something that honors your family's memory without destroying what we've found together. In the reflection of the ancient well, two painted faces looked back at them. Apache and white, warrior and healer, past and future somehow finding a way to coexist. The necklace had belonged to Joseph's grandmother. Two pieces of turquoise carved to fit together like puzzle pieces, worn smooth by generations of Apache women who'd understood that love sometimes required difficult choices. Joseph held both halves in his weathered hands, feeling their familiar weight as he sat beside Sarah in the mission garden, where they'd spent so many evenings planning a future that suddenly seemed impossibly fragile. The territorial governor's response to their evidence had arrived that morning, delivered by a cavalry courier who'd looked around the mission ruins with obvious disdain before handing over the official envelope with its territorial seal. Sarah had read the letter aloud, her voice growing smaller with each carefully worded paragraph that expressed concern and promised thorough investigation, while making it clear that no real action would be taken against decorated cavalry officers based on the testimony of hostile Apache elements. They buried it, Sarah said, still clutching the letter that had crushed their hopes for legal justice. 3 months of waiting, of believing that evidence and truth would matter, and they just buried it. Joseph turned the necklace halves over in his palms, remembering his grandmother's words about how some paths required separation before they could lead back together. The Apache war party would return when the moon was full, in 2 days' time, expecting his answer to their demand for blood vengeance. If he rode with them, he would become what the world expected him to be, a renegade, an outlaw, a man with nothing left to lose. If he stayed, he would remain a wanted man whose presence endangered everyone he cared about. Maybe, he said quietly, it's time to stop pretending we can change what the world is. Apache and white, we live in different countries even when we stand on same ground. Sarah took one half of the necklace from his hands, her fingers tracing the carved patterns that seemed to flow from turquoise into turquoise, like water, finding its level. Joseph, no. We've come too far to give up now. Have we been living in a dream that feels real, until you try to touch it? Joseph's voice carried the weight of too many disappointments, too many betrayals, too many moments when hope had turned to ash in his mouth. White world will never accept Apache renegade. Apache world will never accept warrior who chooses white woman over blood duty. Then maybe we create a world of our own, Sarah. Joseph's voice was gentle but final. Look around, see where we are, hiding in ruins of dead priests' dreams, pretending that love can survive when everyone with power wants to destroy it. Sarah stood abruptly, pacing to the edge of the garden where wild roses climbed the mission walls in defiant splendor. So that's it. You're going to ride away with the war party, become everything they say you are, throw away everything we've built here. Not riding with war party, not seeking vengeance that will only bring more death. Joseph joined her by the roses, their thorns catching moonlight like tiny stars. But cannot stay here either. Cannot keep putting you in danger just because I am selfish enough to want what I cannot have. What are you saying? Joseph pressed one half of the necklace into her palm, his fingers closing her hand around the carved stone. "I'm saying you should go to California. Build your clinic, help people who need healing, live the life you planned before Apache renegade complicated everything." Sarah stared down at the turquoise in her hand, understanding the symbolism. As long as they each held one half, they remained connected across whatever distance separated them. But it also meant accepting that separation was necessary, that love sometimes meant letting go. "And what about you? We'll find another place to disappear. Mexico, maybe, or deep into Apache country where white law cannot follow." Joseph's voice was steady, but Sarah heard the pain beneath his careful control. "Will carry my half of grandmother's necklace. Remember, woman who taught Apache warrior what laughter sounds like." Sarah closed her fist around the turquoise, feeling its smooth surface warm against her skin. "How long do I wait before I assume you're not coming back? Do not wait. Live, build beautiful things, help people, be the healer you were meant to be." Joseph touched her face with infinite gentleness. "If someday the world changes, if someday Apache and white can stand together without bringing death to everyone around them, then maybe. Joseph smiled, the expression transforming his painted features into something approaching hope. Maybe two halves of one necklace will find their way back together. The valley in Mexico was nothing like the places Sarah had imagined when she'd first dreamed of starting over. No bustling California town with its promise of gold rush prosperity, no established community where a woman with medical training could simply hang out a shingle and begin healing the sick. Instead, she found herself in a remote canyon where the Rio Grande carved a green ribbon through desert mountains, where refugees and outcasts had gradually gathered to build something that had no name in any language but felt like hope, taking root in unlikely soil. Joseph stood beside the small adobe house they'd built with their own hands, watching the sun rise over peaks that belonged to no nation's maps. The war paint was long gone, washed away in the river, where they'd been married by a Mexican priest who'd asked no questions about wanted posters, or the woman's Apache husband who spoke English with the precision of someone who'd learned it in cavalry schools. Sarah's hand rested on the gentle swell of her belly, 6 months along with the child that would be born a citizen of this borderland, where laws mattered less than the simple fact of being willing to help your neighbors survive another day. The seed pouch hung from her belt, corn, beans, and squash seeds she'd carried from Iowa, along with herb seeds gathered from the mission garden, and plants Joseph had shown her in the desert. A collection of possibilities waiting for the right soil and the right season to become something nourishing. "The Hendersons are talking about moving on," Sarah said, settling into the chair Joseph had carved from oak wood salvaged from an abandoned hacienda. "California still calls to them, gold fields and opportunity, and all the dreams they left Missouri to find." Joseph nodded, unsurprised. Of the original wagon train refugees who'd followed them into Mexico, only half had chosen to stay in the valley. The others had gradually drifted away, drawn by the promise of easier lives in established towns where being an American citizen counted for something, and the future looked more certain than the experiment they were building here. "And Fletcher? Fletcher's stayed. Says his trading post is finally profitable, and he's got more business than he can handle from the miners and ranchers passing through." Sarah smiled, remembering the soft merchant who'd discovered he had a gift for languages and negotiation. "Maria and Roberto are expanding the store again. They're talking about sending for Roberto's nephew from Phoenix." The community had grown slowly but steadily, Mexican families fleeing revolution, Apache bands seeking peace away from reservation life, white settlers who'd tired of towns where prosperity required forgetting your humanity. They called their settlement nothing in particular, though the Spanish-speaking residents had taken to calling it Esperanza. Hope, and the name had stuck with the gentle persistence of desert plants, finding water. Sarah reached into the seed pouch and withdrew a handful of corn kernels, each one carrying the genetic memory of 1,000 harvests. "Do you ever regret it? giving up the chance for revenge, choosing this life over the justice your people demanded. Joseph was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes studying the terraced gardens that stepped down to the river, where children from 3 cultures played together in the morning light. Sometimes I think about the men who killed my family. Wonder if they still sleep easily, if they still receive medals for their service to white civilization. And then I watch Apache children, learning to read Spanish from Mexican teacher, see white families sharing corn with Indian neighbors, hear my unborn child's heartbeat in the silence before dawn. Joseph's hand covered hers on her belly. Maybe there is more than one kind of justice. Maybe building something good is better than destroying something evil. A rider appeared on the canyon rim, silhouetted against the brightening sky. Sarah tensed instinctively. Old habits from months of running and hiding died hard, but Joseph remained relaxed. "Is Martinez's boy," he said, recognizing the horse and rider, "probably bringing news from the trading post." The rider descended the winding trail, his horse picking its way carefully between the scattered houses and garden plots that marked their community's organic growth. When he reached their porch, the young man's face was bright with excitement. "Señor Joseph, Señora Sarah, a letter came for you with the supply train from El Paso, from someone called David in a place called Denver." Sarah's heart leaped. Her son had found them, somehow tracked their path across territories and borders to this valley that existed on no official maps, but had become more real to her than any place she'd ever lived. The rattle was a marvel of patient craftsmanship, carved from mesquite wood and filled with tiny stones from the Rio Grande, its surface smooth as silk and decorated with symbols that told the story of 2 peoples becoming one. Joseph had worked on it through the long nights of Sarah's final month, his weathered hands shaping something beautiful from the desert's gifts, while his wife slept restlessly in the heat that seemed to press down on their valley like a blessing that had grown too heavy to carry comfortably. Now, 3 days after their daughter's birth, he held the rattle just out of reach of impossibly small fingers that grasped at air and light, with the determined focus of someone discovering that the world contained wonders worth reaching toward. Little star named for Joseph's first daughter and Sarah's hope that this child would navigate by different lights than the ones that had guided their own difficult journey. Blinked dark eyes that seemed to hold depths no 3-day-old should possess. "She's trying to focus on it," Sarah said, her voice carrying the exhausted wonder of a woman who'd brought new life into being through sheer force of will and the grace of whatever spirits watched over impossible dreams. "Look how she follows the sound." Joseph shook the rattle gently, and Little Star's head turned toward the soft music of stone against wood. Then, as if the sound had unlocked something precious and long hidden in her tiny chest, the baby smiled, not the reflexive expression newborns sometimes wore, but a genuine response to joy that transformed her wrinkled features into something radiant. The smile reached her eyes, crinkled the corners of her mouth, and was accompanied by a sound that stopped Joseph's heart and started it again with a rhythm he'd thought he'd forgotten. Baby laughter, pure and unguarded, and bright as water over stones in morning sunlight. "Joseph," Sarah whispered, her own eyes bright with tears. "Listen." But Joseph was already listening, already remembering, already feeling the careful walls he'd built around his heart crumble like ancient adobe in desert rain. This was the sound he'd carried through 7 years of loneliness, the echo he'd thought lost forever, when cavalry soldiers destroyed everything that had ever made him believe in tomorrow. His first daughter's laughter, now reborn in this child who would grow up knowing that love was possible, even in a world that seemed determined to choose hatred over hope. "Remember now," he said, his voice thick with emotions he'd almost forgotten he was capable of feeling. "I remember what it sounds like." Sarah reached for his hand, her fingers intertwining with his, as they watched their daughter discover that rattles made music, and music made joy, and joy was worth sharing, even when you were too young to understand that such sharing was a gift beyond price. Outside their adobe walls, the sounds of their chosen community drifted through open windows, children playing in the river, Women singing as they ground corn, men discussing the day's work in 3 languages that had learned to coexist without translating everything into terms of victory and defeat. The baby's laughter rose above it all, clear and true and completely unaware that she was the bridge between worlds that had spent generations trying to destroy each other. In her small hands, Apache heritage and white dreams became simply the raw materials from which she would build whatever future seemed worth believing in. Her laughter said that such futures were not only possible, but inevitable, as natural as water finding its way to the sea or seeds finding their way towards sunlight. "Do you think she'll remember this place when she's grown?" Sarah asked, adjusting the tiny blanket Maria Martinez had woven from wool dyed with desert flowers. "Do you think she'll understand what it means that we chose to build something together instead of tearing things apart?" Joseph shook the rattle again, delighting in the immediate response. Another smile, another burst of baby laughter that seemed to contain all the music he'd ever need to hear. She will know that her parents chose love over hate, hope over fear, building over destroy. Will know that Apache warrior and white healer can create something beautiful together if they are brave enough to ignore what everyone says is impossible. Little Star's tiny fist closed around her father's finger with surprising strength, and Joseph understood that some promises were made, not in words but in the simple decision to keep reaching toward whatever brought you joy. No matter how many voices told you such reaching was foolish, or dangerous, or doomed to disappoint. The desert wind carried the scent of sage and possibility through their small window, and somewhere in the distance, the evening song of coyotes began, wild voices calling to each other across the vastness. Proof that even in the loneliest places, no one had to sing alone.